which you can afterwards look at, maybe even buy, which deals with the topics that our guest has researched for a while now. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Onyeka Nubia, although he prefers to be known just by one name. So as you'll see, this is the name you have on the books and the publications. He's quite a distinguished speaker, very interested in certain areas of history. We are keen to teach at Brookes as well, relating to intersectionality, relating to aspects of history which are less touched upon, but very, very important in terms of their contemporary relevance. Of course, he's got his interest in particular periods, as we'll hear in his talk. So he's very keen to promote this new reading of British history in particular, and history, more broadly. So he's done a lot of work in terms of lecturing, contributing to newspapers, being a consultant for various BBC programs. But he's also a proper researcher at the university. He's a research fellow at the University of Huddersfield and a writing resident at Narrative Eye in London. So you have a person who's actually both academic and non-academic. And I thought that would be quite an interesting mix for us to observe. Have people from within the field talking about this topic, but also someone who's actually from outside the field, giving us a fresh perspective for certain things relating to what we can now safely call, the black presence in Tudor's England. And this is the topic of his lecture today. I hope you'll enjoy it. We'll have time for questions afterwards, and I hope you prepare for a good 50 or so minutes of a talk. Dr. Nubia.
So we're in very exciting times. These are great times of change. Change in the way in which we see things, our perceptions of the country in which we are now living in, the history of that country, our ability to reassess, rewrite, and think differently about the society that we are now in, and to think differently about the history of that society. These are very, very exciting times. I've got a question actually before I continue. How many of you are lecturers or teachers here or elsewhere? Great. Just so I know which ones of you are the chorus, and which ones of you are the choir, which ones of you are potential adversaries, and which ones of you are potential not. It's always good to actually find out from an audience what your level of knowledge is. Because some of you may have a wide knowledge, some of you may have a more narrow knowledge. So some of what I have to say, well, you'll say, well, of course, that makes perfectly logical sense. Some of you will say, well, even with the initial things that one has to say, you may feel flabbergasted, confused by it. However, in the short time that we have, it is not possible for me to deliver to you a full lecture on the diversity of England in the early modern period. It's not possible to do it in 50 minutes. It took me 26 years of my life of research to get to this point. So it's not possible in 50 minutes to deliver that to you. So if you're discerning people, which I suspect that you are, you're going to say, oh, but what about this? And what about that? You'll have more of that than you will perhaps have answers. But that can't be helped. I want us to think, first of all, about the nature of how we see ethnicity and how we see nations. So, we're now in the 21st century. This is the monarch that has served longest on the British throne, Queen Elizabeth II. When, in the future, perhaps 200 years, 250 years into the future, we look at the nature of British society, this might be the first image, perhaps the only image that we see of the 21st century. Does this image provide the definitive definition of Britain in the 21st century? Of course this image doesn't. Why would we presume that it does? we know that in the same time that this monarch ruled, this country was extremely diverse. All of you lived in this country. This country experienced many different changes whilst this person was a monarch. And yet we would never think of this image being the definitive image. And yet, you may, bless you, and yet you may swallow wholeheartedly a notional idea of England's past by them presenting to you an image of a king or a queen, be it Henry VIII, or Elizabeth I, or some other monarch, and you may say, oh yes, I know about Elizabethan period, I know what Elizabethan period looked like. This is the picture of the monarch of the Elizabethan period. This is the picture of Henry VII. But that image does not tell us everything about that age in the same way that this image doesn't tell us everything about the 21st century. Windrush. It's some term that might be familiar to you, even for those that look at modern history. Windrush is often portrayed as the moment when Britain became, inverted commas, multicultural, multi-ethnic or diverse. Before Windrush, 1948, before the Empire Windrush came, there were no people of colour or Muslims or anybody else that wasn't white and Christian in this country. It doesn't matter that the first people that came here who happened to be from Europe were not Christian either. It doesn't matter. The point is that from 1948 onwards, this is when diversity is supposed to happen. It's supposed to happen from, and before that moment in time, there was no diversity. That's the general idea and concept. It's a totally false concept. It's untrue. Sometimes historians, meaning well, academics, sometimes get it wrong, make a cursory statement about the nature of England's past. Sometimes historians that are more well-voiced on the modern period, that's the 18th, 19th century, look back on the 15th and 16th century, precluding with a post-colonial mindset the ideas of the 19th and 20th century, and then place them on the 15th and 16th century when England was not an imperial nation. And when England wasn't even Britain, they claim that it was British imperialism when Britain didn't even exist in the 15th or the 16th century. One of those writers, who is a very good writer on the 18th and 19th century and somewhat on the 20th century, is Peter Fryer. He says that Africans in the 15th and 16th century were isolated, strange, transient, that means moving from one place to another and not settled, strolling players. It's almost romantic, but totally wrong. Kim Hall in Things of Darkness says the African is too accidental and solitary to be given an historical statistic. Accidental, solitary, to be given a historical statistic. In other words, not worthy of study. Kenneth Little, in a book called Negroes in Britain, writes, doubts if the black man, whether of African or East Indian origin, was a familiar figure until well on in the 16th century, except as a chance visitor, it must be lost. or when imported from Portuguese and colonial territories, in other words, a slave. Imported suggests that he is some sort of product. Yeah, so some sort of product that has to be passed from one place to another. So these are the kinds of ideas that academics would write about Africans during the period that we're talking about. In reality, England has been ethnically diverse for a very, very, very long time, depending on how you see ethnicity, that is. So, Africans, that means people of African descent, have been part and parcel of English society for thousands of years. There were Africans from North Africa who came with the Celts. Between 800 BCE to 450 BCE. There were Africans that came with the Romans from 55 BCE until the 5th century when the Romans started leaving. There were Africans also that came with the Vandals. What they often don't tell you is that yes, whilst the Vandals are an European set of people, the Vandals that invaded England in the 5th century were Vandals that were in fact living in Africa. And the army that the Vandals brought was an African army led by Europeans in the 5th century. And they came at the same time as the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jews. There were also Africans amongst the Vikings and Danish raiders from 700 CE onwards. Some of the images of these Vikings and other African presence can be seen in images such as this. On my left is the African, and on my right is the European. These images can be seen across Europe from 800 BCE all the way up into the 15th and the 16th century. Images such as this, a black Norman knight and his lady, as seen in J.A. Rogers' Sex and Race. This, the Doomsday Abbevito image, 13th century, showing an African hanging from the letter I. Africans and people from Arabia came to Europe through invasions from the 8th to the 16th century. In the 8th century, Gibel al-Tariq from North Africa invaded with an army, mostly of African Berbers, but some people from Syria and Arabia. And this army, led by Gibel al-Tariq, that the Rock of Gibraltar is named after, invaded and conquered the Iberian Peninsula, which you might call now Spain and Portugal, held on to territories in Spain and Portugal for the next 600 or 700 years. Added to that population of people of African descent that conquered and lived in the Iberian Peninsula were also people from Iraq, people from Syria, people from Arabia. These populations formed ruling elites and ordinary people that became part and parcel of European society from the 8th century until the 15th century. The images of these invasions are to be seen across Europe. This image, for example, is drawn and painted in Germany, 14th century. This image in France, showing Africans on my left, Europeans on my right, invading Europe in the 14th century. So in the 8th century. This is another image showing Moorish people, people of African descent, invading Europe, 8th century, 9th century, 10th century. The typical Moor in English history is a Blackmoor. This is the coat of arms of Aragon. Aragon being a kingdom that was in Spain, now a principality, showing a Moor's head cropped. Part of the formation of kingdoms and nations in the Iberian Peninsula came about for the destruction of Moorish people and the incorporation of Moorish ideas to create a Spanish identity. The Spanish identity was formed from the shaping, the curtailing, and the sequestration of ideas that came outside of Europe, from Africa, from Arabia, from elsewhere. They adopted the African iconography or imagery to show an origin, if you like, for those ideas. Aragon, of course, is important, fundamentally important to us, because Catherine of Aragon, who was wife of Henry VIII, had these arms, and she was the daughter of King Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile that conquered the last Moorish stronghold of Granada in 1492. This is a picture of Moors playing chess. The Moors reintroduced the game of chess into Europe because it was a game in which black plays white, but white always moves first. It is not a game of equals. White moves first. So the game became a game which Moors played. Anyone know what this is a picture of? From the unfamiliar to the familiar. Anyone? By? Okay. Why is this image important? The image of the Mona Lisa is important because it typifies for many of us an idea about European society, an idea about the Renaissance, an idea about how we see European society. The questions that we have about the Mona Lisa, sexuality, male and femaleness, beauty, center around notions that we feel familiar and are familiar topics to be discussed about Renaissance Europe. No matter how controversial they may be, they revolve around familiar subjects because she is a familiar image. So no matter how controversial somebody thinks that they may be, by conceiving that it may be a man dressed as a woman, or it may be the artists themselves, transmogrified, it is still conventional, because the image is conventional, and the image is well known. Therefore the parameters for radicalism or radical discourse on it are therefore by default limited. This image is an image of the Renaissance. The potentiality for discussions on this, I may suggest, are more radical than those on the Mona Lisa, because this is not a well-known image. And it conjures up, in simplistic form, some of the very notions that we're going to be analysing and looking at today. This is a picture of famous artists of Renaissance Europe. All 6 of them are famous artists of the 16th century. Not 5 of them and 1 African, but all 6. The bottom right-hand corner shows Regiment Indiana, a famous painter and writer, an artist of the 15th and 16th century Renaissance. They helped to revolutionise the way that artists configured the moving body and shape. And yet Regiment Indiana isn't well known to us, but was well known in the Renaissance. Why would that be? Why would we have forgotten Regiment Indiana? This is another famous picture of the Renaissance. It shows an African woman known as Catalina. This picture was drawn in the Renaissance and is as much a part of the Renaissance as the images that you just saw previously of the Mona Lisa. And yet, I may suggest that this may be the first time that any of you have seen it. Why would it be that this image is not well known to you, but the Mona Lisa is? Is it because when we look back at the past with our 21st century perspectives, claiming to be enlightened in the 21st century, in fact all we are doing is looking with Victorian eyes, with a post-colonial mindset on an earlier period, and claiming that we're not being ethnically restricted, but all the time with our post-colonial mindset, our Victorian eyes, we haven't seen the full picture of this country, of this continent. So, in order to help us get a better picture, we should understand a little bit about the Renaissance, because it affects how we see English history. The Renaissance is the name given to that moment of rebirth, that moment of looking back at the past. England, in fact, was quite late in receiving the Renaissance. Other places received it earlier. Mostly places in southern Europe. You wonder why? Why is it always Italy? Southern Spain? Southern France? Why not Germany? Why not northern Germany? Okay, we have artists from Holland, but we don't tend to think of the Renaissance as being resident in Holland. Why not Russia? Why not Poland? Why southern Europe? Why are places like Italy and southern France and Spain and Portugal strongly associated with the Renaissance? Is it because of their connection to the Mediterranean Sea and the ideas that are crossing from the Mediterranean Sea, which gives birth to that Renaissance in Europe? Does Europe's Renaissance happen in the absence of any other continental influence? I would suggest not. In the 14th and the 16th century, in West African kingdoms like Songhai, West African civilizations like Timbuktu, all of those civilizations were going through their own renaissance. It was a multicultural, multi-ethnic renaissance, in the sense that Christians, Muslims, and Jewish people walked and studied and learned side by side with each other in these West African kingdoms. This created a multiplicity of ideas which were exportable. They were exportable most of all, contrary to what some people may believe, in the written form. Africa is not a pre-literate civilization. And anyone that tells you this is a lie, telling you a lie. African civilizations had literature. In fact, these West African civilizations were most famous for their literature. So, these books, these West African books, created by West African scribes, contain poetry, they contain stories about the world, but most of all, they contain information about Europe. I didn't misspeak. These West African scholars were writing about Europe. How on earth were these West African scholars writing about Europe? Because many of the works that they had were from the Greek and Latin writers, like Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. They took these writers and translated these works into Arabic. And then they wrote the works in Arabic as definitive West African scholarship. Not only that, but along the Black Ink roads, this knowledge was also passed to North African civilizations in Morocco, and along the coast to the Ottoman Empire. But the repositories were in places like Timbuktu. Timbuktu had a superior knowledge. The scholars in West African institutions were in some ways, because of their pluralism, more willing to adopt translations than their Ottoman counterparts. These are some of the texts. Some of them over 1,000 years old. These are more of the texts, such as found in 1593, when Timbuktu was conquered by Ahmed al-Mansur from Morocco, using English and other European soldiers. So, this is important because when we received the works here in this country, we often receive these works in Arabic. So, scholars like John Dee, Francis Bacon, and others learnt Arabic to translate these works into English. I know you don't believe what I'm saying. So what I'm asking you to do, go to the British Library yourself and get out the books. And you will see inscriptions like this. This from Ptolemy, written in Venice, 1558, translated from the Arabic into Latin. Originally written in Arabic, now in Latin. Aristotle. Doubtful or superstitious work, very famous works from Aristotle included in here. Again, from the Arabic translation. There are many others like this. To illustrate to you that Europe, to see itself, needed a non-European eye. Often a non-European hand. And a non-European mind. And it is the mixture of these different perspectives that give birth to the Renaissance. It was not purely a European affair. What you may not also know is that there were, and there are, black saints that are worshipped here in Europe. One of them is St. Maurice. St. Maurice is patron saint of knights, but maybe the first time to come across him. And yet, he forms a consistent and persistent part of European mythology. This is a statue to him over Otto I, the Holy Roman Emperor, in the Cathedral of St. Catherine and St. Maurice. Let us note that this cathedral is also named after him. It isn't just that this is St. Maurice himself. This is another image of St. Maurice in the 14th century in Bohemia, in the Czech Republic. Undoubtedly a person of African descent. These are other images of St. Maurice from all over Europe, showing him undoubtedly of African descent and a representation of the divine aspects of knighthood. This from England, from the town of Ilfracombe, 16th century, St. Maurice, St. Mary's Church, also showing St. Maurice. This in Germany, 16th century, showing St. Maurice debating with the Pope. This showing St. Maurice and the Theban Legion. Not only is St. Maurice shown as an African, but the entire legion that he represents is also African, as divine representations throughout Europe. These are Europeans worshipping an aspect of blackness, of Africanness, at a time when many historians would claim to you that this was impossible. This is another picture of St. Maurice and his Theban Legion, Germany, 15th century. A further image, also from Germany, 16th century, showing St. Maurice, unequivocally people of African descent. This is an image of the Queen of Sheba, black with blonde hair. The Queen of Sheba was often typified as a jet black, pure ebony black African woman. Just as Cleopatra in the 14th, 15th and 16th century was conceived by many Europeans as being jet black and a symbol of blackness and beauty. Also Mary, the Mother of God, was often conceived in that way too. In the same way, Balthazar, the Magi who comes to pay service to the infant Jesus, was conceptualized as an African. There are some very important things that we can see in this conceptualization. First is that Balthazar is the last to arrive. He's late. Now this isn't some sort of ebonics or eubonics, where the black man is always perceived to be the latecomer, but something else. Why is the African arriving late? Something else we might also notice is that St. Maurice has modern attire. I don't mean modern as in 21st century attire, I mean modern as in 16th century attire. That same attire, you could see Henry VIII wearing it. It's modern. It's modern when compared to his counterparts. We also might note that Balthazar is the youngest of the Magi. Why would he be the youngest? Why would he come late? What are these artists trying to conceive? Is it just by chance? Is it just this one picture? Are there any other images like this? Is it by chance? This is another image. 15th, 16th century. I want us to look very carefully at this image. In it, we see Balthazar and his daughter arriving last. We should note that Balthazar is almost a foot taller than his counterparts. Why would they paint a black man in 15th, 16th century Europe as being more dignified than his counterparts, dressed in white like an angel, arriving last, stealing the show, center of attention? Your eyes may be drawn to him more than you're drawn to the infant child, which looks rather scrawny and rather small in the corner there. Whereas he, dignified, upright, your eyes are drawn to him first, rather than the infant Jesus. There's a close-up. This image from an altarpiece in Sweden, 15th century, showing Balthazar on the left, the youngest, again, arriving late. He's so young in this picture, he's beardless, without a beard. Youth, vitality. This from Poland, 15th century, again showing Balthazar, arriving late, beardless, youthful, energetic. This is not by chance, but I know you're not convinced. But you must be, surely. What we're seeing here is something about European society that is hitherto not been analysed, discussed. Why hasn't anybody analysed it? Mostly because people haven't taken the time to do the research. Why would we see these iconographic images played out over and over and over and over again across Europe, from the Czech Republic all the way to England? Why would we see an African representing the youthful vitality? Is it because this African represents something about European society, not just African society? What could this African in the 15th or the 16th century represent about European society? That he could be a cipher or a symbol. What? For the vitality of the new church, a representation of the new church, the spotless black that represents the new church, untainted by the sin of the old Catholic Church or the old Church of Europe, taking on the religion in a clean and pure way, and therefore by default of his and her blackness, representing something which Europeans who adopt Christianity wish to also adapt and adopt. Adapt to their own circumstances and adopt because it is pure, unspotted and perfect. That blackness being a cipher or a symbol of that pureness, that perfection. Okay, so these Africans that we've been looking at mirror real Africans that lived in England. These Africans that lived in England, got married in England, got baptized in England, had children in England during the 14th, 15th and 16th century, during Shakespeare's lifetime, when King Henry VIII, when Queen Elizabeth I, when James I were monarchs. Such Africans included Deirdre Durankwa, baptized at the age of 20 from the country of Guinea in St Mildred's Poultry in London. They include Nosso Ananabeli, the son of Nosso Ananabeli, Walter Ananabeli, baptized in Tottenham, Haringey, London, 1610-11, on the 8th year of King James, 1610. So these Africans that we've just been talking about, this noble and dignified African, represented something about real Africans that were living in England at this time. And in Scotland, the Scottish kings put on an event called the Romance of the Black Lady. The Romance of the Black Lady and the Wild Knight. When the King of Scotland, King James IV, dressed as a black knight and serenaded an African woman. This is the King of Scotland, serenading an African woman. The African woman being the symbol of beauty and divinity. Not only was this event held in which the African woman, Helen More, who came from Spain, was serenaded in that fashion, but the events were organised by an African event planner. So, this event planner was called Peter de Maurian, and this is a record of his accounts from 1503 all the way to 1512. Who was this Maurian? Why did Peter de Maurian choose a name like Maurian? Well, the first thing is that Maurian comes from an English tradition, an ancient English tradition, even before England was England, because there was a Maurian who was a black knight, part of King Arthur's court. He wasn't the only one. He wasn't the only one. It's not a question of modern political correctness. I know some people jump up and down and lose their minds when they see an African in a film set in the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century or any other time before that moment in time. I see all the comments on YouTube, the people write in the dark recess of their chat rooms complaining about political correctness. If they happen to see a Muslim woman in one of these films, or a black man, or an African man, or an Asian man, or anybody else who isn't white and Christian. But, thankfully for us, the people of the history that we claim from this country, when they wrote down that history, either in mythology or in actuality, didn't have the same preconceptions that we now have about ethnicity and race. I wouldn't say that they didn't understand difference, but they didn't understand race in the way in which we now understand race. So they were willing to conceptualize things that we might think that they were unable to conceptualize. So when they wrote about King Arthur's court, they included non-Christian knights and African knights as part and parcel of the tapestry of English mythology. One of them was Morian. Morian appears in the 13th century romances. It's called the Romance of Morian. He is a black knight, described as being black within black within black. Morian actually means black from the Moors, meaning Greek, from the Greek word for black. Here he is on the right-hand side, top right-hand side, showing his unequivocally person of African descent. So, these images of Morian are important because it helps us to explain or understand that even 15th or 16th century Englishmen, looking back at English past to make sense of their reality, would have seen Africans as part of their mythology, which would have justified the African presence in their present existence. So if I say to you, for example, there was a myth, I don't doubt that there was a myth, that St. Thomas of Becket's mother was a black woman of Syria. That might be the first time that you ever heard it. It might be the last time that you ever heard it, because I doubt anybody else is ever going to tell you that. And that this mythology about St. Thomas of Becket was believed by people in the 15th and 16th century. I have no doubt that it's completely untrue, but the point is that the mythology was believed by people in the 15th and 16th century. And images of that black woman of Syria, who was St. Thomas of Becket's mother in mythology, was a popular image in 15th, 16th century England. Why don't we know that? Perhaps we don't know it because we don't read what people actually write in the 15th and 16th century, except for Shakespeare or Ben Jonson. And we think that if we read Shakespeare or other people like that, then we get an idea of what's happening in this period. We need to read wider, and we find this. So, in English society, we find people of African descent. They include people like James Curran as being a Moor Christian. The word Moor here is not meaning Muslim, as some of you may believe. Oh, but Onyeka, Moor means Muslim. And some of you are going to say that because that's perhaps what you've been taught. Here we have the word Moor clearly illustrating something other than religion, because he's a Christian. He won't be a Muslim Christian. That's too much of a contradiction, even for 15th century English writing. Moor means his ethnicity, other than religion. And here he is being married to Margaret Person on the 24th of December 1617 in London. So we have a marriage between someone of African descent and Margaret Person, a maid who's probably not of African descent, otherwise it would have been written down. So that's very, very interesting, because what might be told to you is that we were living in a society where segregation was to be found. Here is a record which illustrates to you that, at least in this instance, there was not that kind of segregation that prevented people of African descent and European descent from being married together. This isn't just a morganatic union. This isn't just a liaison in the dead of night. This is a marriage solemnized by the church, the English church, which is supposed to be so bigoted and prejudiced, and yet is open-minded enough to marry these individuals. And many others like them, actually. To illustrate this, Joanne Poynting, the wife of Thomas Poynting, being a Blackmoor, now buried on the 13th day of the plague, September, buried at St George's Parish in Bristol. Joanne Poynting, in fact, is the Blackmoor, even though it looks like it's the other way round. Joanne Poynting is the Blackmoor wife of Thomas Poynting. Yes? So this illustrates that not only were men of African descent marrying white English women, but white English men were marrying women of African descent in England. And some of those children of that descent are people like yourselves, from Bristol, from Plymouth, from London, from all different parts of the country, who may feel that you don't have any African descent in your family tree whatsoever. Check again. Other records include people like Domingo, being a black Negro servant to Sir William Winter, buried the 27th of August, 1587. I kept the Old English spelling. Here is a longer description of Domingo. Domingo being a Guinea Nigario, a servant of the white worshipful William Winter, dwelling in the Abbey Place, Manor House, East Smithfield, 1587. Died of consumption. He had the best cloth. Now, not everybody gets the best cloth. He must have done something in his service, in his life, to deserve the best cloth when he was buried. There was also Simon Valencia, who was probably from Valencia, in the Iberian Peninsula. A Blackmoor buried 20th of August, 1593. He was a servant to Stephen Driffield, a needlemaker. There is also Anne Vassy, or Anne Vase, a Blackmoor wife to Anthony Vassy, trumpeter of the said country, buried in London, 24th of April, 1618. Anne Vass and Anthony Vass are both probably Blackamoors, people of African descent. There's also Mary Phyllis of Morosco. Mary Phyllis of Morosco's record is a very long record. It lasts about 16 pages. On the parish record memorandum daybook, in which it is included. The memorandum daybook was a large document constructed by priests and clerks, which spoke about the people that were buried in their parishes. Usually priests were not too concerned about ordinary people that were born, baptized, married, and died in their parishes, because they were ordinary people. Mary Phyllis of Moscow is an exception. The description of her baptism is very, very lengthy. It's the largest record for a commoner inside that daybook. Why? Why is her record important? Because it details, it explains how she willingly became a Christian. Not by force. Not by force, but by choice. After being in this country for 13 years. Here's a small snippet of that same record. This part of the record explains the names of the people who were witnesses. That's the whole parish coming out. So not only is this young woman who is 20 years old at the point of her baptism, and who has been living in this country for 13 years, and who came to this country with her father called Phyllis of Morosco, but it shows that this young woman was part of a parish and a community. Not an isolated, strange, transient individual, but someone that was part of a community that wanted to celebrate her baptism. This is a call, if you like, for localism in your discourses, for an exploration or a discussion of communalism and community and what family meant in English society, and that family was possible to include people of different colours and ethnicities, even religions. So this is probably one of the most well-known images. It is of John Blank on the Westminster Tournament Hall of 1511. John Blank is the central figure, the Black Trumpeter, and this tournament was created to celebrate the birth of the son of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. The son didn't live very long, but the celebrations took place in Westminster in 1511, and John Blank is the central figure, wearing a green turban laced with gold. Please note the difference between his attire and the attire of his counterparts. We must know something about the nature of Tudor society. You had to get a dispensation attire that is different from your counterparts? Why would he get such a dispensation? Perhaps he has flowing dreadlocks like Bob Marley. I've often wondered what is under that. Under that turban. Whether it's a massive, Pangria style afro that would have frightened the audience, or whether he had massive dreadlocks that flowed. Why is it that John Blank wears a turban and his counterparts don't? Is it that the turban represents something about the Moorish culture that the English people wish to be represented in? What does he represent about Moorish culture? Something about the Iberian culture. Is the Moorish culture linked to the Iberian culture? Is the Moorish culture the best representation of the Iberian culture? Is it part of a culture that is perhaps conceptually perceived as being more advanced than English society? And that's why they want him to represent that culture by wearing a turban. This is the payment to him, also from the same period. This is a painting, it's in Dulwich and Picture Gallery, it was, 1670, showing three boys. Let's put aside our preconceived ideas. It doesn't show two boys and a servant, it's called three boys. Now, when we look at this image, what do our minds think? Do we think, when we see this image, that we are seeing a young boy begging? Is that what our minds think? Do our minds think that? Because the image and the inscription doesn't tell us this. Why would the painter paint the young boy of African descent as the central figure? It's a conceit within artistic work, for the most part, that the central figure is nearly always the most important. It's not always the case. Certainly in this case, he could have painted this image any way he wanted. They could have all been sitting. The African boy is the central figure. Why is the African boy the central figure? Why is he standing while his other counterparts are sitting? Is there not an exchange taking place between two boys of a similar status? One for food, the other perhaps for wine or water. But the point is that the African boy is the central figure, a central figure. This other thing, which is immensely interesting, by Gilbert Jackson from Bristol, showing Florence Pollitt and Thomas Smythe, or it's an image of Florence Pollitt. Thomas Smythe, 1640, showing a boy of African descent and a white woman, a white young girl. And notice in this image that she is looking at you, the viewer. Why is she looking at you? What exchange is taking place between